build it back. I studied architecture, but I'm a novice when it comes to flood insurance, engineering issues.
Rory Martineau at the Center, Deputy Director of Recovery and Resiliency. I manage Build It Back and our RTAPP programs, and even so I would say I have moderate knowledge on this topic.
I'm Angela Davidson with Neighborhood Housing Services. I'm a counselor. I have somewhat knowledgeable about the flood insurance, as we have the guru in our office, so I've learned a lot from her, but still mediocre.
My name is Emil Harris. I'm with Neighborhood Housing Services of Northern Queens. I'm a counselor. I know a little bit about insurance, but not too depth into the flood insurance or engineering process.
I'm Aaron Shadwald. I work at New York Legal Assistance Group, and would you say moderate? Moderate.
I'm Jordan Shipley. I'm a new staff attorney at New York Legal Assistance Group as well, and I'm pretty new to all of this.
I'm Nadine Gavai. I'm also a new staff attorney at New York Legal Assistance Group, and I also have a moderate background in insurance, not flood insurance, but insurance in general.
I'm Maura Guillaume. I'm with Impact Brooklyn as a program manager and a counselor for foreclosure. And this is like, okay, that's a new language to me.
Hey, Martin, and NHS Queens program coordinator for foreclosure counselor. A little bit about insurance, but not much in-depth knowledge of the flood and the engineering, even though I do understand the numbers.
Pat Julian in Pratt, Brooklyn. I am the director of the Home Services Department. This is so I'm here to just soak up everything.
Richard Trout, Director of NHS Emergency Services. I'm familiar with insurance, but flood insurance I'm not, so this is very new and interesting for me.
Gerard Miller, Financial Literacy Counselor for NHS. Have some building experience and some knowledge of insurance, but not to this extent.
Sarah Milmadov, a program associate with the center, and I'm coordinating both with some RTAPP programs with the engineers, as well as some with Build It Back. I've learned a lot more since we started working on the RTAPP program than I did before, so just something to add to that.
Jennifer Leisure, this center, I am a program associate with RTAPP coordinating counselors. Like many of you, I've been able to see the effects of floods and the effects of flood insurance claims, but certainly I'm new, relatively new to the mitigation strategies.
Kevin Wolf, Program Associate at the Center. I'm pretty new to flood insurance as well. I'm here just to listen in. I'll be helping out with some of the outreach efforts.
Hi, I'm Allison Anthony. I am the Communications Manager at the Center. Prior to that, I was an attorney helping Build It Back applicants, so I have a cursory knowledge of it for when it came up with those applicants, but I know this is going to be a lot more in depth.
All right. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I started with the flood insurance program in 1992. I joined Dewberry in 2002, but for the first 10 years I worked for the state of Connecticut as the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for the state, and I still have to think through some of this stuff when I'm giving presentations like this. So the other interesting part is back then there was nobody, with the exception of maybe local officials who enforced the program standards, there was really nobody understood about the program. So it's intriguing to me that there's almost 20 people in this room who at least have some level of understanding and knowledge of it. I'm gonna dive right into the material, but I'd like to keep this as casual as we can, and I'll stop after each of the mitigation options that we'll be looking at, and feel free to jump in or ask questions or whatever. I don't have a full hour's worth of material, but a couple of things to set the stage. Some of this was mentioned briefly already before we start, but really the key to everything here is the lowest floor, or that elevation that was in C2A or C2B on the elevation certificate. So unlike most building codes, unlike most regulations, unlike how most people think, FEMA describes a basement as any space that is below ground on all 4 sides. So you can have a 3-foot crawl space, and if it's a foot below ground all the way around it, by FEMA definition for the National Flood Insurance Program, that's a basement and becomes the building's lowest floor. Crawl spaces in the NFIP world are really not a distinct definition. And fully enclosed areas below the base flood elevation are areas that are fully enclosed, but that are wet flood proofed and allow water to enter and exit the building without any type of human intervention. And that, if you have that type of design, and we'll get into more of the details of that, then the next highest floor becomes your lowest floor. But the key is understanding what the lowest floor is. The base flood elevation is from the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. For this project, we'll be using the preliminary maps that are still subject to change, but as was mentioned, that's probably 3 years down the road. So we're using the best available data, and we'll be getting elevations. That information will be already in the platform for you. And then the design flood elevation incorporates that 2 feet of additional elevation or freeboard that the New York City Building Code requires for single-family properties. So that's the difference between base flood elevation and design flood elevation. What is permitted / required versus what helps? Sometimes it's confusing because we'll talk about things like dry flood proofing, and people will say, oh, dry flood proofing is not allowed for residential structures. It's not disallowed. It just doesn't get you any help with your flood insurance rate. And if you're substantially damaged or do a substantial improvement, it doesn't. Then it's not allowed by the FEMA regulations for that purpose. You can't bring a building into compliance using dry flood proofing. So there's some options that I'll try to make the distinction as I go through that are targeted at both protecting the building and lowering premiums. And there are other options that are just protecting the building that don't really help with the flood insurance premiums. In case anybody doesn't know, substantial damage is any damage that a building receives that exceeds 50% of the value of the structure, not counting the land. And obviously, it's all about location in New York. Real estate is very expensive because it's located in New York, but we're really talking about the 50% of the value of the building. So the building might only be a $75,000 or $150,000 structure. So that's how you find that threshold. Similarly, for substantial improvement, if you're not damaged and you just want to do an improvement, that can trigger the compliance requirement where you have to either elevate or wet flood proof. So just to be aware of that. Any questions before I move forward?
What is wet flood proof? Sorry.
We're going to get into that in a bunch of detail in about 3 or 4 slides. And before I go any further, I want to introduce Susan Tierney in the back of the room. She's our lead auditor.
Hi.
And she's also invited to jump in with to correct me if I'm wrong or to add any technical details if you need to.
I thought we started at 11:30.
Yeah, we switched things up.
Okay.
All right, so in the platform there will be several options that our engineers will select based on what will work with the buildings, both structurally and from a cost perspective. And we're going to go through each of those now. The highest and most desirable option is to be able to elevate a building 2 feet above the base flood elevation. It not only provides the best insurance rating, but it also provides the highest level of protection. And when you raise to that freeboard or extra 2 feet above the BFE, it drives the insurance even further down. In a lot of cases, this will not be structurally feasible or it may be cost prohibitive. And we'll get into some of the reasons why for that. And there's also 2 distinct things about elevation. We mentioned the zones. The AE zone is essentially I hate to use the word non-coastal zone, but it's a zone without wave action. It could be riverine or it could be storm surge. And a V zone is an area where there's velocity or wave action on top of the surge. So in addition to rising water, you can get banged into by waves and damage from that. Question?
I know this is a little far along, but are we going to be talking about the different design elements that are available to homeowners if they have an elevation option? And I know this is even farther along, but I know this is not something that we're going to be doing, but is there going to be any consideration of soil factors in trying to cost out how much an elevation is going to run someone?
We're going to be looking at it from a structural perspective, whether or not it can be done or not based on the building. We won't be doing any design. We will be based on what we see with the building and the type of construction and the type of foundation. We'll be drilling down and narrowing that cost estimate range. But in almost every case with the recommendations we make, and this is a great question because the counselors need to be aware of this, there will be instances where we may recommend an option, and when it's further examined or designed, they may find factors like soil conditions or things that we can't do within the context of this project that may eliminate the project from being feasible. So we're going to give multiple options. We're going to be pretty sure based on our experience that it will work, but it won't get into the design.
We're going to have disclaimers.
Yeah, a lot of disclaimers, yes.
Sort of standard and appropriate about,
And
what
Susan,
other factors need to be.
Susan, who will lead our team, has run an elevation program in New Jersey for.
I mean, so there might be conversations that you guys are having in
Right.
the audit, but when we're talking to the homeowners, then, we all should be on the same page about what we need to make sure that we're,
Absolutely.
especially we are saying to the homeowner that's doing legal advice about things that they need to consider.
Absolutely.
In putting that together, not to take, everybody should be a part of that, but, so I just want to make sure that I know. But otherwise, when you guys are talking about not necessarily design options, but different ways of elevating a home, there's going to be, based on what you guys think is feasible, different presentations about the way that people can design, basically depending on the building, but like if you have a single detached structure, you have more options generally speaking.
Right.
And so there's going to be presentations with different options depending on what you guys think is feasible and costing that's appropriate for that.
It's going to be more of a structural determination based on a visual assessment of whether or not it appears to be feasible.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does appear to be feasible, we'll add value to that by giving the reasons why, talking about the construction type, balloon construction versus frame construction, and why that will impact the cost and things of that nature. We won't be making specific design recommendations.
Yeah.
Which do impact the price.
Right.
You can do a bare bone elevation and estimate that it's going to fall within this range, but if you want to add bells and whistles and breakaway walls and different things for aesthetic purposes, you can quickly get outside of the range. But there's a lot of literature available that the counselors can bring, and we can help you identify that to kind of.
It can be overwhelming at first. There is too much information to give
And
you.
you will-
So it's good to start with the basics and go from there.
You will run into a lot of people who think like, when they think elevation, they think of their house up on stilts, and they think that it's ugly and they don't want anything to do with it. There's a lot of literature that shows really great examples of designs and how you can make homes look nice and elevate at the same time.
Well, I mean, in the city, there's going to be a design requirement, so that's something I think realistically, if we're talking with people, especially in certain neighborhoods about elevating, then, you guys don't have to talk about that, but I think realistically we can avoid talking with them about that, and so, we definitely need to be conversant on that, and like you're saying, because there's a lot of literature, we may want to read that literature and be familiar with that literature, but the homeowners don't want to read that literature, they don't want to be familiar with it.
Right.
They want, like a paragraph or a 30-second conversation about that sort of stuff at this point in time, so I just want to see what we're.
Agreed.
And we are doing a rapid assessment to begin with, so we will go in and we will try to identify those items that would be more costly, such as balloon framing. Now, balloon framing, you can't always tell right away. You may have to do some investigative services before you can determine what that is. It depends on the type of access that we have over there, what recommendations we'll make. And if we can't tell them, we will tell you that also.
Do we have access to the slide, the
Yes.
slideshow?
We'll send it out.
Okay.
Definitely. All right.
Just a good point on that, Aaron. We will actually working with the engineers to include a disclaimer into the report as well, so it's very clear.
Okay.
This is a rapid assessment, not really going through the design. Really, I think this is, for a lot of homeowners, it's going to be an introduction to, what the potential next steps would be. I don't think, they'll likely leave the counseling session maybe with some information, to discuss with, the family members, but I don't think the next step would for many of these homeowners would be like, okay, let's find an architect now who wants to elevate.
Yeah, I would suspect that people who are going through this process are not the people who have been interested and excited since 2013 about what they want to do with their houses.
Right.
So they're
Yeah.
probably not ready to put money down and go for it. Yeah.
And it's a big investment too. All right, so I'm going to talk first about elevating in an AE zone, or the zone without any wave action. And in this particular case, you elevate, when you elevate, now what you think of as the first floor becomes the lowest floor for insurance purposes. And the area below that floor, the area in which you've elevated, has to be vented, had flood vents. They have to be sized a certain way, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then this area down there is now limited to storage, access to the building, and parking. And I say there can be no enclosed spaces down there. There have been examples where picture walking into a garage in a basement and you walk up a stairway into the first floor. People like to enclose that stairway and store, make a storage area. If that enclosure is more than 3 square feet, or 300 square feet, sorry, it becomes the lowest floor all over again. So, and I say no enclosures, there can be nothing constructed inside the space, and the space has to be, not include finished materials. So really just basic cold storage, building access, and parking, but at least you still have the space. In the velocity zone, and we'll probably have fewer of these in New York City than AE zones, considerably fewer. It's the lowest horizontal structural member of the building that has to be above the design flood elevation. And what that means is instead of the top of the floor that you walk on, it's the bottom of the structural component, like the floor joist, that has to be above the design flood elevation in a velocity zone.
Or the girder supporting the joist.
Or the girder supporting.
So it winds up going, it typically goes up at least one more foot
Yeah.
than whatever the freeboard is.
Correct. And in a V zone, that area, you can't have a solid wall that's vented with the flood vents. It has to be free of obstruction, or it can be constructed with breakaway walls. So you don't need to have it, you have it up on stilts like that, but you can build what's called breakaway walls around it. And they're, as the name implies, walls that are intended to collapse without causing damage to the structure or the foundation, but it makes it look like an enclosed space. It gives protection to your car and your belongings and things that you store in that space. Otherwise, with those two distinctions, lowest horizontal structural member versus lowest floor, and breakaway walls instead of flood openings, then the methodology is essentially the same.
And flood openings go with breakaway walls also. If you're enclosing that with breakaway walls, then you have to insert flood vents into that space also. The intent is that the wave action would push the wall in, not just water pressure. The water pressure would be less.
Right. People will ask you, maybe they will, they may ask you, well, I've got garage doors, can I just put the garage doors up instead of the openings? And the openings have to be free from human intervention, so garage doors do not count as openings. You can put openings in the garage doors, but the idea is to allow the water through the bottom of the structure without any structural damage and without any need for human intervention. So you could be on vacation in Florida and you get the flood and it operates the same exact way. But we've witnessed plenty of people who will design it properly, get the permit, get the certificate of occupancy, and then cover up the openings from the inside and turn it into the the illegal apartment or the in-law space. It's their prerogative. They're not going to get their claim isn't going to be paid properly if they do that. So again, floodable area below the design flood elevation, limited to parking, access, and storage. No full enclosures within the space, that framing in the stairway. It allows you to treat the lowest floor as the first floor for flood now, or the first floor becomes the lowest floor for insurance rating purposes. And with this, some other things to consider, because people will probably ask, with this particular mitigation option, it's going to require disconnecting the water, disconnecting the sewer, disconnecting the electricity. So there's going to be some displacement time during construction, and there's going to be costs associated with that. That will vary, but it's probably going to be in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 weeks at least. It depends on construction season, depends on if there's economies of scale, if they're doing multiple homes in the same area. There's all kinds of factors that play into that, but that's definitely going to be a consideration. Another consideration is all the equipment or things that might have been in that crawl space or basement or other area have to be moved somewhere. So that either to the attic, to a closet on the first floor, or to a separate structure that's constructed like an addition that's above the design flood elevation. So got to have consideration of where all that type of equipment is going to work. Even duct work for your forced hot air system needs to be above the design flood elevation, in this case 2 feet above BFE. Any questions on elevation before we move on?
So are you, I guess it builds it back, typically homeowners have to relocate for 6 months, but if, looking in the private market, if a homeowner were to, you know, want to pursue elevation on their own, you're estimating 3 to 4 weeks of displacement?
That may be overly optimistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, good call. It could be done that quickly,
Right.
but it would be probably the exception rather than the norm. We'll have to, actually, we should revisit that and come up with a more solid number. 6 months, I think, is way too long,
Right.
but 3 weeks maybe not enough.
Yeah, in New Jersey, the REM program, which is the Rehabilitation, Reconstruction, Elevation Mitigation Grant Program, in the contracts from the state, it had that the builder had to have the homeowner back into the property within 90 days. And that was a very tight schedule. And some of the items that interrupted that schedule were getting the disconnects and getting the inspections, having the inspectors come out and approve the foundation before you place the concrete for the footing. Top of block, there were interim inspection points that the inspectors couldn't keep up with. So that slowed schedule as well as other items that come up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whenever you're doing renovation work, there's some surprise along the way. You open up a wall and you find something that's non-compliant. You're disconnecting electrical services that are 60 years old, and no electrical contractor wants to buy the electrical in that house. So there are other items that will come up depending on the age of the home and what's found during construction.
Yeah, a good point. Clearly I misspoke in the 3 to 4 weeks, so I'm glad that you brought that up and we could clarify. The other thing that, and I don't know how this would play into the counseling, but as Susan just alluded to, there are always surprises when you do this, depending on the age of the house, the type of wall, even interior walls. You get cracks and things that need to be repaired. And so back when I used to run a grant program in the state of Connecticut, we always encourage people to add some kind of 20% contingency onto the the cost at the end that the contractor gave them just for these things. It's like any home repair project. You open something up and you find 3 things that you didn't know you were going to find, and that's something that people should be, not to scare them off from doing it, but it's something that people should be prepared for emotionally, if not financially.
Sorry, what is the difference again between the BFE and the DFE?
The BFE is the FEMA mapped 100-year floodplain. The DFE would be that plus 2 to comply with the
Plus 2.
Right, it's the base flood elevation versus the design flood elevation. All right, so the cost range for elevation is typically 100 to 300. And there could be anomalies on the high side. And build it back, we haven't seen any anomalies on the low side. Everything has been everything has been over 100. And again, back in the 90s when I was doing this, it was 125 to 150 was like the norm in Connecticut, and it's probably going to be more expensive here because you're dealing with different things. So I think in most cases we're going to be in the 100 to 200 range, but our engineers will add, we're not just going to say, here you go, it's going to be 100 to 300,000. We're going to say, based on what we observed, that number is more like 100 to 150 or 200 to 250, so that we're not going to be able to give them a precise number in this exercise, but we're going to be able to hone that range in based on what we observe.
So will that increase the value of my home if I elevate the home? Because I'm paying 100 to 300,000.
In theory, it should increase the value of your home because your flood insurance, the money that you're going to be saving over the life of the building, every one of these before the actual work is done, especially if it's funded by a grant of any sort, is gonna have to have a benefit cost analysis that tells you whether it's worth it to do this in the long run or not. And savings on insurance can be factored into that. The useful life of the building is factored into that. But I would certainly think it would make a property more marketable. Whether or not it increases its value by 100 or 200,000, I don't know.
But it could protect the resale value, let's say, once the map change or whatever.
Right.
If your home is elevated and your neighbor says that your house is more valuable than the one that's susceptible to flood damage.
True.
Yeah.
True. What about your, as an engineer, what about your attached locations? Like the person in the middle is rising because of the two are not. How are you doing?
It won't be an option.
Yeah, a lot of times this option will not work
It will not
because
work
of the type of
So
construction.
everyone has to pretty much comply.
Right, so we're gonna be looking at all appurtenances, we're gonna be looking at chimneys, we're gonna be looking at party walls and things like
Right.
that, and all of that will factor into whether or not this can be a recommendation.
Gotcha.
And I've given presentations at conferences where contractors have been in the audience and they will fight with me and say that anything can be elevated.
Yeah.
And you can accomplish anything if you have an unlimited supply of money, it's just not cost effective.
So you're saying if a home is attached, it cannot be elevated?
In
It
some
can,
cases,
right?
it can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In some cases, not.
When you have multiple property owners, then, you know, if you have a duplex and both parties are involved, I have never had that situation where both parties would choose to go up, but it's going to be very rare.
A lot of things factor in if they share a heating plant, for example, and one wants to do it and the other one doesn't want to do it, or one can afford to do it and the other one can. You can't, you know, dealing with putting the neighbor out of their home for 90 days or 60 days is all these things factor into the equation.
I'd like to chime in quickly about the home value. It's on page 11 of your materials. The city did some estimates of value decrease based on flood insurance increase, and the high end of it is they estimate that a $500 increase in your annual flood insurance premium can cause a $10,000 decrease in your home's value over time. So if if you're looking at a $5,000 increase, that's a $100,000 decrease. Again, if you're getting into the $200,000 and $300,000 range, it's not necessarily going to balance out, but it does affect. In the long run, once the market catches up, as we talked about last time, I think the market hasn't caught up yet. Once the market catches up, we're going to see greater decreases in values for coastal homes that aren't owned.
And there's things you can do too. I mean, like in Florida, they used to have a program called Fortified for Safer Living. The Institute for Business and Home Safety would kind of brand a resilient house as Fortified for Safer Living, and they use it as a marketing tool amongst in the real estate community to drive value of those houses up because they're safer than neighboring properties, and I can see something like that being valuable here too, potentially. Wet flood proofing is not a whole lot different than elevation. There's two different scenarios. There's wet flood proofing where no fill is required, and wet flood proofing where fill is required. Where there's no fill required, it would be if you had what we think of as a crawl space that was at grade, not below ground, because remember, if it goes below ground on all sides, it becomes a basement. So if you have a space that is at grade, and then your first floor is already above the base flood elevation or the design flood elevation, then you can essentially move anything that's in that space and vent that space with flood vents properly sized, and I'll get into that sizing to, again, allow that area to flood without causing damage to the foundation or the superstructure and without the need for human intervention. And in that case, instead of that the bottom floor that you see, now the next floor that's above the water becomes the lowest floor for flood insurance rating purposes. Whereas without the wet flood proofing and the flood vents, it would be the level that's on grade below the flood elevation. In cases where you, well, let me get into this first. So we talk a lot about flood vents. The number and size of the vents depends on the size of the structure generally. But the vents have to be 1 square inch for every square foot of area below the flood elevation that you're flooding. So sometimes you accomplish that with 2 vents. There has to be a minimum of 2. Sometimes it takes 4 or 5 or even 8 vents to do that, but as long as that net area of the vent opening is 1 square inch for every square foot of the area below the flood, then they're properly sized. Again, must pass water with no human intervention, and the vents cannot be any more than 1 foot above the ground, so you can't, so the slab is at the grade, the vents are here, the water goes in, you can have no more than a 1 foot pool in that area.
Sorry, when you say 1 inch for every foot below, are you talking 1 vertical foot below or 1
Square foot.
Square foot.
Yeah.
And the vents are to allow for the water to flow in and out freely. Is that what that is for?
Yeah, the idea is if you picture a foundation up to here, surrounded by water, there's hydrostatic forces from the water. Water has a lot of power and weight, or there's hydrodynamic forces where there's water banging into something. So the vents are intended to just let the water equalize and flow through the area without causing pressure or damage to the foundation, right? And they're also designed to allow the water to leave the building when it recedes. The typical cost of floodproofing, wet floodproofing with vents, if you don't need to fill, is on the order of $8,000 to $10,000, $12,000. It can be less than that. The vents themselves are pretty inexpensive, probably in the neighborhood of $1,000 to $1,200 a piece. And the price also fluctuates with how much work it is to install them. Easier to pop one in a garage door, like you saw in the last diagram, than it is to go through a reinforced concrete foundation. So there's some fluctuation there, but generally a much less expensive alternative. The downfalls to this is if that space is usable now, it's not really going to be usable for anything except storage, access, and parking. So a lot of people will discount this option because they just don't want to lose that space. If it's a 3 or 4 foot crawl space and there's no utilities in there, then it's a great option because they're not losing anything really. All right, so with fill, it's essentially the same exact thing, except that area below the ground surface has to now be filled in. And it gets more, and then everything else, once it's filled in, everything else works the same way. It gets more expensive because it's more labor intensive, it's more material intensive, and you also have to do things to if there's a foundation slab, you have to break up that slab so that the water that does get in there can kind of percolate down. And anything to add on that one? Okay. So again, I'm jumping around, but just to recap, we're equalizing hydrostatic, hydrodynamic forces, therefore reducing damage to the foundation, openings no higher than 1 foot above ground, no human intervention, sized properly, 1 square inch for every square foot, net. The space below the VFE, again, is unfinished, used only for building storage, access, parking, and it may require moving electrical, heat, ductwork, anything that's down there below the flood elevation. And it's essentially, I would say, the second most desirable option in terms of flood insurance rating. Typical cost with fill is at the higher end to the 8 or 12, all the way up to like $30,000. Probably usually not going to be that high, but it could be in some cases. All right, so those are 1 and 2. Those are what we'll be looking at as our kind of top priority, top tier recommendations. There may be cases where elevation will not work because of the construction type or shared walls, et cetera, all the things we talked about. There may be cases where people either don't want to or can't afford to do the wet flood proofing option. So kind of the 3rd tier level is to elevate the mechanicals. If you have laundry equipment, furnaces, hot water heaters, electrical panels, telephone equipment in bigger buildings, and those things are below the base flood elevation, there may be opportunities where at a relatively low cost you can elevate those or replace those. Only going to help you in some cases very minimally on the flood insurance. We're talking maybe $100, $200 over the course of a year. but you're getting these things out of harm's way, and you're not gonna have to replace your furnace the next time it floods. And for that, we would look at whether there's spaces in closets on the first floor, possibility of distributed heating systems where instead of one boiler to heat the whole building, each unit could have kind of a separate heating system on the first or second floor above the flood. We look at putting in attics, in some cases building, a small 10 by 10 unfinished addition on to house all the utilities that's above the flood elevation.
No, you just answered my question. I hear from a lot of homeowners that are thinking about like basement fill-in, who are worried about losing all that floor space to the boiler and the water heater, and I've been telling them, build a little something that's elevated on the back of there. So that works, right?
Yeah. It's more expensive, but it works. And then on the exterior, elevating the outside air, air conditioning condensers and things that can be elevated up on platforms. Meters can be put up above the flood elevation, although those are typically owned and used by the electrical providers.
Question?
Yeah.
So if the homeowner decides to move all equipment from the basement and do a structure on the outside, wouldn't that now need building permits?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All of these options require building permits at minimum.
If somebody is considering placing an addition on their home for the mechanicals, you're looking at zoning setbacks also. So it depends on the real estate that's available on the property and how much room they have for setbacks. And if they encroach into a setback, then they have to go through a long process for a zoning variance.
Right.
So this, if the real estate is available, it's a good option. If not, then it becomes a little more expensive and more drawn out.